I came home from the hospital and saw my suitcases on the doorstep. 3 of them, the large burgundy one I'd bought for my trip to Barcelona 15 years ago, the small blue weekender, and my father's ancient leather case. All packed and waiting, like dutiful dogs. Beside them, a cream-colored envelope with my name written in Melissa's perfect cursive. My legs, still weak from 6 weeks of hospital food and fluorescent lighting, threatened to give way. I lowered myself onto the top step, the concrete cold through my thin slacks. The taxi that had brought me from Memorial General had already disappeared around the corner. The house, my house, stood silent before me, the curtains drawn as if in mourning. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers. If you want to stay, the attic is free. Love, your sister-in-law. A joke. It had to be. Some kind of bizarre welcome-home prank that David and Melissa had cooked up. Tasteless, considering I'd just spent weeks battling pneumonia that had turned into sepsis, but perhaps their sense of humor had darkened in my absence. I stood up, wincing as pain shot through my hip, and tried my key in the lock. It didn't fit. The lock had been changed. Not a joke, then. I knocked, softly at first, then with increasing urgency. The door swung open, and there stood Melissa, my brother's widow of 12 years, wearing an expression of mild inconvenience, as if I were a door-to-door salesman interrupting her afternoon tea. "Oh, good, you found the note," she said, brushing imaginary dust from her sleeve. "David Jr. and I thought it would be best if you used the side entrance from now on. Less disruption to our routine." David Jr., my nephew, who had visited me exactly once in the hospital, staying just long enough to ask detailed questions about my health insurance and whether I had made arrangements, should things not work out. "What the hell is going on, Melissa?" My voice emerged stronger than I expected. "Please don't make this difficult, Eleanor. The doctor said you need rest and quiet. The attic has been cleaned and it's perfectly adequate. You'll have your privacy." Privacy? In my own home? The home Richard and I built? Melissa's face hardened. "Things change. David and I have discussed it, and we feel this arrangement is best for everyone. The house is too valuable to maintain as a shrine to my brother. We all need to be practical." Behind her, I glimpsed David Jr. hovering in the hallway. My hallway, with the family photographs I'd arranged along the wall. He was 35 now, no longer the sullen teenager who had come to live with Richard and me after his father died. The boy we'd raised as our own when Melissa fell apart. The same boy who had hugged me at Richard's funeral and promised, "Don't worry, Aunt El. I'll take care of you." "Where's Caroline?" I asked, looking for my niece. "She's away at college, as you know," Melissa said sharply. "She doesn't need to be involved in this transition." I stepped back, supporting myself against the porch railing. "Melissa, this is insane. Richard left this house to me. It's in the will. You can't just—" "The will is being contested," David Jr. said, finally stepping forward. He'd grown to resemble his father, my brother, though without the laugh lines that had softened David Sr.'s face. "There are questions about Uncle Richard's mental capacity when certain changes were made. We've filed the paperwork." "What changes?" "What paperwork?" The world seemed to spin slightly, and I gripped the railing tighter. "We can discuss the details later," Melissa said, her voice taking on the saccharine quality she reserved for difficult clients at her real estate office. "Right now, you need to rest. David will carry your bags up to the attic." "I'm not going to the attic. This is my house." "Mom, she's being difficult," David Jr. called over his shoulder, and I realized that in his mind I'd already been demoted from aunt to inconvenient elderly relative. "Either the attic, or you'll need to find other accommodations," Melissa said. "We've been more than generous, considering the circumstances." "What circumstances?" My voice was rising now, and I could feel the neighbors' eyes on us from behind their curtains. "You're ill, Eleanor. possibly not thinking clearly. The doctors mentioned cognitive concerns. That's a lie. Melissa's smile didn't reach her eyes. We have the medical reports. Dr. Feldman was quite forthcoming about your condition. Dr. Feldman, David Jr.'s college roommate. I looked past them into the house, my house, where Richard and I had hosted Christmas dinners and summer barbecues, where we'd nursed Melissa through her grief and raised her children when she couldn't, where Richard had died in our bedroom, holding my hand and extracting promises I intended to keep. Fine, I said quietly. I'll take the attic, for now. David Jr. smirked as he picked up my suitcases, deliberately bumping one against the doorframe. Melissa stepped aside, allowing me to enter my own home like a guest overstaying her welcome. The house smelled different. Richard's collections had been removed from the living room shelves, replaced by Melissa's porcelain birds. The family photos had been rearranged, with several of Richard and me notably missing. The attic stairs are through here, Melissa said, gesturing toward the narrow door beside the kitchen that had once led to Richard's home office. We've cleared it out to make room. Richard's office. Cleared out. His books, his papers, his life's work as an architectural historian. Gone. I followed them up the narrow stairs, each step a painful reminder of my physical weakness and current powerlessness. The attic was stifling, even in early May, with just 2 small windows at either end. A twin bed had been pushed against one wall, with a small table and lamp beside it. A 3-drawer dresser stood in the corner. My brother's old desk, the one from his college days, had been placed under the window, along with a chair that had seen better days. Bathrooms down the hall, David Jr. said, dropping my suitcases on the bare mattress. Try not to use it after 10. The pipes are loud. I know how the pipes sound, David. I've lived in this house for 30 years. Well, things change, he said, echoing his mother. Dinner's at 6 if you want to join us. Otherwise, we can bring a tray up. Like an invalid, I said. Like a guest, Melissa corrected, her tone suggesting the conversation was over. They left me there, surrounded by the ghosts of Christmas decorations past and carefully labeled boxes of family history. I sank onto the bed, my body aching from the climb and the shock. Through the floorboards, I could hear them talking, their voices rising and falling in the familiar cadence of people who believe themselves safe from eavesdroppers. I pulled my phone from my purse and called the only person I could think of. Margaret? It's Eleanor. I need your help. Eleanor, how are you feeling? I was going to visit tomorrow. I need a lawyer, I said, cutting off my oldest friend. And I need them now. Margaret arrived the next morning with Thomas Whitaker, a small, energetic man with wire-rimmed glasses and a bow tie that seemed at odds with his fierce expression. They can't do this, he said after I'd explained the situation. We were sitting in the local coffee shop 2 blocks from my house. I'd slipped out early, leaving a note that I'd gone for a walk. Doctor's orders. Apparently they can, I said, warming my hands around a cup of tea. They've been planning this for months. David Jr. asked me to sign some papers when I first went into the hospital, something about medical proxies. I thought it was standard hospital procedure. Thomas shook his head. Did you read them? I was running a fever of 103. I could barely see straight. We'll need to get copies, he said, making notes in a small leather book. And the will? You have a copy. In my safety deposit box at First National. Richard made it clear, the house belongs to me until I die. Then it goes to both David Jr. and Caroline equally. And when did Richard pass? 12 years ago, heart attack. Thomas nodded. And you've been financially responsible for the house since then. Taxes, insurance, maintenance, every penny. And when did Melissa and David move in? I sighed. About 5 years ago, Melissa lost her job during the recession. They were going to lose their condo. It was supposed to be temporary, just until they got back on their feet. Margaret reached across the table and squeezed my hand. We'd been friends since college, had stood beside each other through marriages, children, widowhood. She'd warned me about letting Melissa move in. "Tell me about these medical reports they claim to have," Thomas said. I explained about David Jr.'s connection to Dr. Feldman, how they'd played golf together monthly, how Feldman had appeared in my hospital room asking oddly specific questions about my living arrangements. "That's a clear ethical violation," Thomas said, his expression darkening. "We'll add that to our list." "What's our first step?" I asked. "Property records," he said. "I want confirmation that the house is still in your name. Then we'll need to address this contested will claim. It sounds like they're trying to argue that Richard wasn't mentally competent when he left you the house." "Richard was sharp as a tack until the day he died," Margaret interjected. "Everyone knew that." Thomas nodded. "We'll need affidavits from friends, Richard's doctor, anyone who interacted with him regularly near the end. And Eleanor, we need to move quickly. If they've filed paperwork, they've already started the clock." I nodded, feeling a strange calm settle over me. I'd spent 6 weeks fighting for my life in a hospital bed. Fighting for my home seemed like the natural next step. "There's something else," I said, lowering my voice. "Last night, I overheard them talking about the retirement community on Oak Street. They've put down a deposit for me. They're planning to move me there permanently." "Without your consent?" Thomas looked appalled. "Apparently the papers I signed gave David Jr. some kind of authority. I need to see exactly what I put my name to." Thomas closed his notebook. "I'll go to the county clerk's office this morning, then meet you back here at 2 with whatever I find. In the meantime, don't sign anything else. And Eleanor, be careful. People who are willing to manipulate a sick relative are capable of more than you might expect." When I returned to the house, Melissa was waiting in the kitchen, a cup of coffee cooling in front of her. She looked up with practiced concern. "We were worried when we found you gone." "Doctor's orders," I repeated my excuse. "Daily walks for my recovery." "Of course." She stirred her coffee needlessly. "Eleanor, we need to talk about next steps." "Next steps?" "Your living situation. The doctors were quite clear that you'll need ongoing care. David and I have found a lovely place." "I'm staying here, Melissa," I said, taking a seat across from her. "In my home." Her smile tightened. "That's what we need to discuss. The situation with the house is complicated." "Because you're contesting the will?" She had the grace to look surprised. "David mentioned that?" "Well, yes. There are questions about certain changes Richard made just before he died. You understand, we need clarity." "What changes exactly?" "Because the will I saw left the house to me, with both David and Caroline as eventual beneficiaries. Equal shares." Melissa's fingers tapped against her cup. "Richard made verbal promises to David Sr. years ago. Family promises. That this house would stay in the direct family line, with David's descendants." "And I changed that?" I asked, genuinely confused. "You persuaded Richard to change his will when he was vulnerable, to cut out his blood relatives in favor of you." The accusation was so absurd I almost laughed. "Melissa, Richard and I were married for 28 years. We built this house together. His brother, your husband, never lived here, never paid a dime toward it. What direct family line are you talking about?" "The Lawrences have certain traditions," she said stiffly. "Property passes through the male line. It's how things have always been done." "This isn't Downton Abbey," I said. "And Richard rejected those traditions when he married me. He made his wishes perfectly clear." "You had undue influence," she said, her voice hardening. "And now your health issues make it impossible for you to maintain the property. We're simply being practical. By locking me out of my own house, by going through my medical records without permission, by putting me in the attic like some Victorian madwoman. You're being dramatic." And you're being cruel, I said. Did Caroline know about this plan? A flicker of discomfort crossed Melissa's face. Caroline and I had always been close, closer than she was with her own mother. Caroline is focused on her studies, Melissa said dismissively. She doesn't need to be bothered with family business right now. I stood up, steadying myself against the table. I'm going upstairs to rest. And Melissa, I'd appreciate it if you'd stop going through my personal mail. I noticed the stack you've been keeping in your desk. Her eyes widened slightly. During my pre-dawn exploration of the house, I discovered months of my mail. Bank statements, insurance communications, personal letters, hidden in Melissa's desk in what had once been Richard's study. I was simply keeping things organized during your absence, she said. Of course you were, I replied, turning toward the stairs. How thoughtful. I spent the afternoon in the attic, methodically unpacking and taking inventory of what remained of my possessions. Several items were conspicuously missing. My grandmother's silver service, Richard's collection of first-edition architectural books, the small Wyeth painting we'd bought on our 20th anniversary. At precisely 2 o'clock, Margaret texted. Documents collected. Meeting moved to my house. Can you get away? I responded. We'll try. Need pickup. 20 minutes later, I told Melissa I was going for another doctor-recommended walk and met Margaret around the corner. Thomas was waiting at her dining room table, surrounded by papers. Good news and bad news, he said without preamble. The house is still legally in your name. There's no transfer of deed on record, and the property taxes are being paid from your account. And the bad news. They've filed a petition to have you declared mentally incompetent, with David Jr. named as your guardian. They're claiming your recent illness affected your cognitive function, and you're unable to make sound financial decisions. The room seemed to tilt. Based on what evidence? Medical statements from Dr. Feldman primarily, and something called a voluntary guardianship petition, allegedly signed by you. I never signed any such thing. Thomas passed me a document. At the bottom was a signature that resembled mine, but with telltale differences only I would recognize. This is forged, I said, my hand shaking. I never saw this document, let alone signed it. Thomas nodded as if he'd expected this. I thought so. The date coincides with your highest fever, according to your medical records. Even if you had signed it, we could argue you weren't competent at that time. They forged my signature, I repeated, the enormity of the betrayal sinking in. It appears so. Thomas adjusted his glasses. Mrs. Lawrence, I don't say this lightly, but what your relatives are attempting is elder abuse. It's not just unethical, it's criminal. Margaret squeezed my shoulder. Eleanor, you can't go back there. You can stay with me until this is resolved. I shook my head. Number, if I leave, they win. The house is all I have left of Richard. All those memories, 30 years of our life together. I won't be driven out by lies. Then we fight, Thomas said, gathering his papers. I'll file an emergency injunction against the guardianship petition. We'll need a medical evaluation from an independent doctor to counter Feldman's claims. And we'll need to document everything. Every conversation, every action they take. What about the will contest? I asked. Pure smoke and mirrors, Thomas said. I've reviewed the will. It's rock solid. Richard had it drawn up by Johnston and Myers, one of the best firms in the state. It was witnessed by 3 people, notarized, and includes a letter explicitly stating his reasons for the bequest arrangement. They can't touch it. For the first time since seeing my suitcases on the doorstep, I felt a flicker of hope. There's one more thing, I said. I need to contact Caroline. She needs to know what's happening. Is that wise? Margaret asked. She's still young, and it would put her in a terrible position. She's 22, I said. Old enough to know the truth about her family, and she's always been the ethical one, the one who saw through the pretenses. Thomas nodded. Family secrets have a way of poisoning everything they touch. Better to bring things into the light. I returned to the house before dinner, a recorder app activated on my phone and Thomas's business card in my pocket. Whatever came next, I was no longer facing it alone. The next week passed in a strange domestic Cold War. I kept to myself as much as possible, making notes of everything I observed. Melissa's tense phone calls in the garden, David Jr. Late-night visits from a man who looked suspiciously like Dr. Feldman, the methodical removal of family photos that included me. I accessed Richard's old email account, which I'd maintained after his death, and found years of correspondence documenting his intentions for the house. I copied everything to a secure cloud drive Thomas had set up. Most importantly, I managed to call Caroline at college. "Aunt Elle, how are you feeling? Mom said you were still pretty sick." Her genuine concern brought tears to my eyes. "I'm better, sweetheart, but I need to talk to you about something important." "Are you sitting down?" I told her everything. The locked door, the attic, the contested will, the forged documents. Her silence on the other end grew heavier with each revelation. "That can't be right," she said finally, her voice small. "Mom wouldn't, and David wouldn't." "I wish it weren't true," I said gently. "But I need you to know what's happening. I'm not asking you to take sides, Caroline. I just need you to know the truth." "I'm coming home," she said immediately. "I can be there tomorrow." "No, stay where you are. Focus on your finals. I have a good lawyer, and we're handling it. I just didn't want you to be blindsided." "Uncle Richard would be furious," she said. "He always said the house was yours, no matter what. He made us promise, me and David after his diagnosis. He made us promise we'd make sure you were taken care of." My breath caught. His diagnosis? The heart condition. He knew for months before it happened. He sat us down and made us promise we'd look after you, that we'd make sure you always had your home. Richard had known he was dying, had extracted promises from his niece and nephew, had never told me, trying to spare me the anticipatory grief. "Thank you for telling me that, Caroline," I said, wiping away tears. "It means more than you know." "I'm going to call Mom right now," she said, determination hardening her voice. "This isn't right, Aunt Elle. Whatever they think they're doing, it isn't right." After we hung up, I sat by the attic window, watching the street below. The neighborhood had changed, over the decades. New families, new additions, new landscaping, but the bones remained the same. Richard had loved this view, had designed our bedroom window specifically to frame the old oak tree at the corner. Now I understood why Melissa had insisted on taking the master bedroom when she moved in. It wasn't just the space. It was the symbolic displacement. She was erasing me from the narrative, one room at a time. My phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. "Injunction granted. Hearing scheduled for Monday. Need you at office tomorrow 10 a.m. for medical evaluation." A small victory, but significant. They couldn't move forward with the guardianship petition until after the hearing. I had breathing room. My phone buzzed again, this time with Caroline's name. "Just talked to Mom. She denied everything. Said you're confused. I don't believe her. Coming home tomorrow." Below, a car pulled into the driveway, David Jr.'s BMW. He slammed the door as he got out, his body language radiating anger. The front door opened and closed with equal force. Raised voices drifted up from below. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Discord in the ranks. I smiled for the first time in days. Caroline arrived the next afternoon while I was at Thomas's office. By the time I returned, she was seated at the kitchen table, her eyes red from crying, Melissa hovering nearby with an expression of wounded maternal dignity. "Aunt Eleanor," Caroline said, standing to hug me. "I'm so glad you're okay." "Oh, she's fine," Melissa said sharply. despite what she's been telling you. I returned Caroline's hug, noting the tension in her shoulders. It's good to see you, sweetheart. How are your finals? Don't change the subject, Melissa snapped. Caroline, your aunt has been making wild accusations. Are they wild if they're true? Caroline interrupted. I've seen the papers, Mom. I found them in David's desk. The guardianship petition, the retirement home brochures, the revised property history you created to contest Uncle Richard's will. Melissa's face paled. You had no right to go through your brother's things. And you had no right to try to steal Aunt Elle's house, Caroline shot back. What were you thinking, that I wouldn't find out? That I'd just go along with sending her to some facility while you two divided up the spoils? You don't understand the financial realities, Melissa said, her voice hardening. This house is worth over $1 million. That money could secure your future, David's future. At the expense of Aunt Elle's present, the woman who helped raise me, who sat with me through every fever, every heartbreak, every college application. I'm your mother. And you taught me right from wrong, Caroline said. Or at least, I thought you did. I placed a hand on Caroline's arm. Where's David? At work, Melissa said curtly. Unlike some people, he has responsibilities. More like he's hiding, Caroline muttered. He knew I was coming home. Knew I'd find out eventually. Melissa's phone rang and she glanced at it with evident relief. I need to take this. We'll continue this discussion later. After she left the room, Caroline turned to me, her young face etched with adult concerns. It's worse than you know, Aunt Elle. They've been planning this for nearly a year, ever since Mom got her real estate license and realized what the property values in this neighborhood have become. I had my suspicions, I said, but I didn't want to believe it. There's more. I think David's in financial trouble. Gambling debts, maybe. I found collection notices in his room. And Mom's been talking about moving to Florida, buying a condo on the beach. With my money. With Richard's legacy. Carolyn, I don't want you to feel caught in the middle, I said. This isn't your battle. She shook her head, her expression suddenly so like Richard's that it took my breath away. Uncle Richard made me promise, Aunt Elle. He said, Caroline, your aunt will never ask for help, but someday she might need it. Promise me you'll step up. I'm keeping that promise. I blinked back tears. Even from beyond, Richard was looking out for me. First things first, I said, finding my resolve. I need you to help me find something. The safe was still there, hidden in the floor of what had once been Richard's office, now Melissa's domain. It took us nearly an hour to clear away the rug and furniture without being detected, but Caroline stood guard while I worked the combination, our wedding anniversary, forward and back. Inside was everything I'd hoped for. Original copies of our wills, property deeds, insurance policies, and something I hadn't expected, a sealed envelope with my name in Richard's handwriting, dated 3 days before his death. My dearest Eleanor, it began. If you're reading this, something has gone wrong. I instructed Thomas to give you this letter only if someone contested my will or tried to remove you from our home. I pray that never happens, but I know my family's history and the greed that sometimes surfaces in the Lawrence line. He went on to detail conversations with both Melissa and David Jr. in the months before his death. Their subtle inquiries about the will, their suggestions that perhaps the house was too much for me to manage alone. How he'd shut down those conversations firmly, making his wishes clear. Most damning of all, he'd recorded those conversations. The small flash drive taped to the letter contained audio files carefully labeled and dated. I hope you never need these, the letter concluded. But if you do, use them without mercy. Our home is yours, Eleanor. The life we built is yours to continue. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. All my love, Forever, Richard. Caroline hugged me as I wept, overwhelmed by Richard's foresight and the depth of his love, still protecting me years after his death. "What do we do now?" she asked when I'd composed myself. I tucked the letter and flash drive into my pocket. "Now we end this." Thomas arranged an emergency hearing for the following morning. Dr. Feldman was subpoenaed, as were Melissa and David Jr. Caroline insisted on testifying on my behalf. The courtroom was small, the proceedings less formal than I'd expected. Judge Harriet Chen, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, reviewed the documents before her with sharp eyes. "Let me see if I understand the situation," she said after the preliminary statements. "Mrs. Eleanor Lawrence, you're contesting a guardianship petition filed by your nephew, claiming it was made under false pretenses and with a forged signature. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Thomas replied on my behalf. "And Mr. Lawrence, you maintain that your aunt signed this document willingly and that it accurately reflects her wishes, due to her diminished mental capacity." David Jr. shifted uncomfortably at the defendant's table. "Yes, Your Honor." "And Dr. Feldman, you've provided medical testimony supporting Mr. Lawrence's petition?" Dr. Feldman, looking considerably less confident than when he'd visited my hospital room, nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, based on my observations." "Even though Mrs. Lawrence was not your patient?" I consulted on her case." "Without her knowledge or consent," Thomas interjected, "in violation of HIPAA regulations." Judge Chen's eyebrow rose. "Indeed? We'll come back to that. Mrs. Lawrence, could you please approach?" I walked to the witness stand, my heart pounding but my steps steady. "Mrs. Lawrence, how long have you lived in your current home?" 30 years, Your Honor. My husband and I built it in 1993. "And the property is in your name?" "Yes. Richard left it to me in his will, with provisions that it would go to both his niece and nephew equally after my death." "And your illness? Could you describe that for the court?" I explained my hospital stay, the pneumonia that had developed into sepsis, the slow recovery. "During this illness, did you experience any cognitive impairment?" "I had high fevers, Your Honor, and there were days when I was quite confused, but those symptoms resolved weeks ago. My current doctor has cleared me of any cognitive concerns." Thomas presented my latest medical evaluation, conducted the previous day by a neurologist from the University Hospital. Judge Chen reviewed it, then looked at Dr. Feldman. "Doctor, could you explain the basis for your conclusion that Mrs. Lawrence requires a guardian?" Dr. Feldman squirmed visibly. "I observed signs of confusion and disorientation consistent with early dementia. During these consultations that weren't officially requested." Yes. "And did you conduct any formal cognitive assessments? Standard tests?" "No, Your Honor. It was more of an observational analysis." Judge Chen's expression spoke volumes. "I see." The hearing continued with testimony from Caroline, who detailed finding the documents in her brother's desk and her mother's admission of their plan to sell the house. She said, and I quote, "Once we get Eleanor settled at Oak Ridge, we can list the property immediately. The market's hot right now," Caroline testified, her voice steady despite Melissa's glare from across the room. Finally, Thomas played selected recordings from Richard's flash drive, conversations from 12 years earlier that clearly established his intentions for the house and Melissa's and David Jr. Says acknowledgement of those wishes. Melissa's face drained of color. David Jr. whispered urgently to his attorney. Judge Chen listened to it all without expression, occasionally making notes. When the evidence was complete, she removed her glasses and addressed the room. "I've seen many family disputes in this courtroom," she said, "but rarely have I seen such a calculated attempt to disenfranchise a vulnerable relative. The guardianship petition is denied. Furthermore, I'm referring Dr. Feldman to the State Medical Board for ethics violations, And I strongly suggest that Mr. Lawrence and Mrs. Melissa Lawrence consider their positions carefully before I decide whether to refer this matter to the district attorney for possible criminal charges." She looked directly at me. "Mrs. Lawrence, do you wish to pursue criminal charges against your relatives for attempted fraud and elder abuse?" The courtroom fell silent. Melissa's eyes widened in panic. David Jr. stared at the table. I thought about 30 years in that house, about Richard's love and foresight, about Caroline's courage in standing up to her family. "No, Your Honor," I said finally, "but I do have one request." "Yes. I'd like a restraining order requiring them to vacate my home immediately." Judge Chen's mouth curved in the barest suggestion of a smile. "Granted. They have 48 hours to remove their belongings." That evening, Caroline helped me move my things down from the attic. Melissa and David Jr. worked in grim silence, packing their possessions under Caroline's watchful eye. "You could have sent us to jail," Melissa said, as she wrapped her porcelain birds in newspaper. "Why didn't you?" "Because we're still family," I replied. "Broken, damaged family, but family nonetheless. And because Caroline doesn't deserve to have her mother and brother in prison." "I didn't want it to go this far," she said quietly. "It was David's idea after his gambling debts. I don't want to hear it, Melissa. Not tonight. Maybe someday, but not tonight." She nodded, resuming her packing with trembling hands. In the living room, I found David Jr. taking down the television he'd installed above the fireplace. "I'm sorry," he said without looking at me. "I convinced myself that you'd be better off in a facility with care, that the house was wasted on just one person. And the $1 million it's worth had nothing to do with it." He flinched. "I made mistakes. Bad ones. Yes, you did. And someday you'll have to make amends. Not just to me, but to your sister. You betrayed her trust as much as mine." He nodded, unable to meet my eyes. By midnight, the house was quiet again. Caroline had gone to stay with a friend, promising to return the next day to help me reclaim the space. Melissa and David Jr. had left with what they could pack in their cars, arrangements made for movers to collect the rest. I walked through each room slowly, reacquainting myself with my home. In the master bedroom, I opened the windows to release the lingering scent of Melissa's perfume. In Richard's office, I ran my fingers along the empty bookshelves, imagining his beloved architectural volumes back in place. On the mantel, I placed our wedding photo, one of the few items Melissa hadn't managed to misplace during my absence. Richard's eyes seemed to twinkle at me from the silver frame, his arm around my waist, both of us laughing at some forgotten joke. "I kept my promise," I told him. "I protected our home." Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, washing away the last traces of the day's drama. I made a cup of tea and settled into my favorite chair, feeling the weight of the past weeks finally begin to lift. Tomorrow, I would change the locks again. Thomas would help me file paperwork to ensure nothing like this could happen again. Caroline would visit, and we would begin the slow work of rebuilding family bonds that could still be salvaged. But tonight, I was simply home. Not in the attic, not as a guest, but as the rightful owner of the life Richard and I had built together. I raised my teacup in a silent toast to him, to the love that continued to sustain me, to the quiet strength I'd found in myself when I needed it most. Outside, the rain fell steadily, cleansing and renewing. Inside, I was